Good afternoon and welcome to our lunchtime webinar on risk and supervision in an outcome-focused regulatory environment. Thank you for joining us. I am Helen Venn and I am one of the managers in the supervision function at the SRA. I'm here today with Andrew Garbutt, the Director of the Risk Centre. Let me begin by outlining the webinar format. Shortly I will hand over to Andrew, who will talk about the SRA's risk function. I will then go on to talk about the SRA's supervision function and the pilots that have been and continue to run. There are two polling questions that we will be asking you as we welcome and encourage your views and feedback, which is useful to help us shape our approach. There will also be time at the end for us to take questions, and also at the end of the webinar we will provide the CPD code for today's webinar, which you will need to claim the CPD hours. Finally, the slides from the webinar this afternoon will be available on our website. So to begin, I'll hand over to Andrew, who will be talking about risk.
Thank you, Helen, and good afternoon, everybody. In the webinar today, I'm going to focus on how we will assess risk in firms. But before I do, I just briefly want to touch on why the SRA is committed to becoming a risk-based regulator and the advantages that risk assessment will bring to the SRA and to you as firms. So, why assess risk? Like many other organisations, the SRA has objectives that, if they are met, will mean that we are successfully delivering on our goals as an organisation. We have the strategic objectives in our business plan, which outline what we want to achieve in the day-to-day delivery of our business. Unlike other organisations, though, as a regulator we also have to deliver against the regulatory objectives set out in Section 1 of the Legal Services Act. In order to deliver successfully on those objectives, we need to be able to identify, assess and control any risks to us achieving them, and our risk assessment framework is the means we are implementing to do so. In addition, the SRA has finite resources. Through the delivery of our transformation programme, the SRA is becoming a leaner organisation, but we still have to deliver a wide range of functions, from pathways to qualification, authorisation of new firms, individuals, COBs and COFRs, administration of the compensation fund, not to mention the supervision of over 11,000 firms. Risk assessment allows us to prioritise those finite resources in the areas where the real risks are, enabling the delivery of the wide range of functions we're responsible for. Our risk assessment framework is also moving us to a position where we can be more proactive, if not predictive, in our regulatory activity. In the past, the SRA has been very reactive, picking up events that have usually already taken place and dealing with the aftermath. The aim of risk assessment is to identify those issues before they become serious, allowing us to constructively engage with firms at an early stage, avoiding in many cases the need for enforcement action. When we talk about risk assessment, there are 4 key areas where it will feature. We will assess the risks inherent in firms, which I'm going to talk about in more detail today. We'll also assess the risks presented by the events that get reported to the SRA, and again I'm going to cover that in my webinar today. We will also be assessing thematic risk, and those are the risks that affect groups of firms, sectors of the legal services market, or the market as a whole. Our requirements this year in respect of your arrangements for complaints handling is a current example of our thematic risks and what requires our attention. Finally, we will also assess the risk our own internal operations pose to us in successfully meeting our objectives. So, when we talk about risk, what do we mean? Risk assessment has 2 limbs: the assessment of impact, and that's what the effects might be on our objectives, and probability. What is the likelihood of an event or issue occurring? It's through the consideration of both of these aspects that we will be considering risk. Looking at how we assess risk in firms in more detail now, what do we use our risk assessments for? Well, one of the primary purposes of risk assessment of firms is to determine the approach to supervision that is appropriate for your firm. With 11,000 firms ranging from global firms to sole practitioners, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to supervision, and we cannot and should not try to apply one. The approach to supervision we have ranges from low-intensity desk-based monitoring through to high-intensity relationship management, and it's by assessing the impact a firm might have on our regulatory objectives that we determine which of these approaches is the right one for your firm. This approach to measuring the impact a firm might have is not new, and other regulators employ this approach, particularly when, like us, there is a large population of firms to regulate. So how do we measure impact? Well, firstly, we look at the size of the firm as measured by turnover, the number of fee earners, and that's both admitted and unadmitted fee earners, and the branch structure. Do you have branches in England and Wales? And do you have branches outside England and Wales? There is a simple economic rationale for why size is an important measure of impact. Research carried out in 2010 shows that despite the fact that 85% of the firms we regulate have 4 partners or less, almost 40% of the total revenues generated from legal services are generated by the top 10 firms by size, and almost 75% by the top 100 firms. And this emphasises the importance that the large firms have in the legal services market. Our regulatory objectives are not solely focused on the economics of the legal services market, however, and there are significant aspects of consumer protection inherent in those objectives. So we need to use other measures that reflect those objectives in our assessment of impact. So as a result, we're also including measures that represent the vulnerability of a client base. For example, do you do work in mental health or immigration where clients are particularly vulnerable? Or do you deliver a significant level of services through public funding? You're also including the holding of client money as a relevant factor. Unlike many other regulated sectors, 82% of our regulated firms hold client money, and that presents an obvious risk to consumer assets. The approach that we're taking gives us the flexibility to try different combinations and weightings of these measures to try and make sure that the firms we assess as high impact are genuinely so. Being a small firm, but one which only works in immigration work, does not make you a high impact firm, and it is a combination of all the factors that will do so. Early results from the relationship management pilot, which Helen will cover later in the webinar, are being used to establish if we have the balance of these factors right. We've matched the engagement time required for the firms taking part in the pilot to our assessment of impact, and the two broadly agree. The firms the risk centre have identified as high impact using these measures are those that required the highest levels of engagement during the relationship management pilot. What I hope you've noticed as I've explained how the measures of impact that we use is that the information we're using to do so is already provided by you through the annual renewals process, and for new firms will be provided on application for authorisation. The SRA has taken the decision that wherever the information we hold is suitable for the job, we will use it, and that prevents the need for us to ask firms for new information. We do recognise that every piece of information we ask for imparts a burden on the firms that have to provide it. Risk assessment isn't all about supervision though. The risk assessments we carry out will deliver information to our staff wherever they are engaging with firms. And in each of these areas, our assessments will inform decision making using a consistent framework of risks. That framework considers risks in 4 key areas: fraud and dishonesty, financial difficulties and instability, operational risk, that's how you deliver services to your clients, and competency, fitness and propriety. Within each of these categories, there are more detailed risks that we have identified, and by assessing risks by category in this way, it allows us to engage with firms only in the areas where risks are highlighted, and this moves the SRA away from the tick box approach that we may have adopted in the past. In considering these risks, we've tried to identify leading indicators that these risks might be occurring, which again highlights our desire to engage with firms before issues become serious. In order to identify our risk indicators, we've conducted statistical analysis of structural and regulatory factors, again using data that we already hold, or where we can obtain it from sources other than through firms. We've also carried out reviews of all cases where serious failings have been identified, so that we can identify what the warning signs are and apply them to our risk assessments. These risk categories are not static, however, and as the legal services market changes, so will our view of the risks that are present. As we've already stated in our consultations and policy statements, this is an evolving approach, and we're already looking to evaluate this risk assessment framework as we learn more about the segmentation of the legal services market and the influence of external factors linked to the economy or political change, and we will become more sophisticated in our assessment of risk in firms. Inevitably, as we develop this approach, the nature of information we need about firms will change, and new information will have to supplement or replace the information that we currently ask for. So, what else do we use risk assessments for? In 2008, the SRA took the decision to apply a consistent risk assessment process to the events that are reported to us, and that was delivered through our Risk Assessment and Designation Centre, which is now part of our new Risk Centre. Every report that's made to us is assessed using a combination of tests that establish the level of risk the event presents. And to give you some idea of scale, the Risk Centre currently assesses over 1,200 reports per month made by members of the profession, the public, referred by the Legal Ombudsman and through our work with other regulators and law enforcement agencies. Every report we receive is assessed for the nature of the risk, the impact that event might have if proven to be true, and that could be a financial impact on a client, the number of clients that may have been affected, or the impact on the public confidence in the profession. We also carry out an assessment on the reliability of the source. Has that source reported information to us in the past, and if so, what was the outcome? And we also measure the strength of the evidence provided in support of that report. This has given us a much more consistent approach to the reports we receive on an individual event level. A much wider benefit, however, has come from the information it provides across the whole range of reports that we receive. Since we started risk assessing events in our ADC, for the first time we've been able to match an initial assessment of risk to the final regulatory outcome after our investigation has finished. Our analysis of this information demonstrates that in some areas we were applying investigative resources that were disproportionate to the level of risk at assessment and also to the level of risk as demonstrated by the final regulatory outcome. What this means is that as well as our resources being disproportionately applied, there is a disproportionate impact on you as firms. And as a result, we substantially reconsidered our investigative protocols and we applied a new process to considering these reports as they were identified at risk assessment. As a result of those new processes, in the first 6 months of operation, over 300 cases that would have resulted in an investigation, usually by exchange of correspondence, were closed in a single step, at most with the issuing of advice or guidance to the firm. And that's a practical demonstration of the benefits that can be achieved through the use of risk assessment. The analysis of this data also allows us to identify emerging trends in reports made to us, which may be more effectively dealt with through dealing with the issue itself as a theme or a project, rather than through individual investigation of each firm that gets reported to us. So that covers what risk assessment is. What is risk assessment not? Well, risk assessment is not the answer to all the regulatory challenges the SRA faces. It is just a tool that the frontline staff can use to inform their decision making, and it's not a substitute for the judgment of those members of staff. Our risk assessments will provide contextual information that can be coupled, for example, to the knowledge of a firm an individual supervisor might have. It can be coupled to the experience that our staff have of dealing with many firms and to the information that flows from our engagement with you. The design of the risk assessment framework recognises that the information picked up through engagement with a firm, at the authorisation stage, through supervision or enforcement, is information the SRA cannot currently obtain through other means. And it's important in gaining a rounded picture of the risk in a firm that we have that information recorded. Perhaps most importantly, the ability to record risk information flowing from engagement with a firm allows our staff to record information about the controls that are in place within your firms to mitigate risk. And that recognises the efforts that well-run firms make to deliver safe legal services to their clients. Risk assessment is also not a means of publicly identifying firms or individuals as high impact or high risk. Our assessments will remain confidential to us. Remember, our assessment of risk is only a method of identifying the level of supervision that is appropriate to your firm, and then within that approach, how intensive our relationship with you should be. So what does risk assessment mean for you? We've already demonstrated through our risk assessment of events that risk assessment can deliver more consistency in how those individual events are treated, but can also deliver at a wider level a much more proportionate approach to our regulatory activities. We also aim to be transparent about our risk assessment methodologies. Where we assess events is explained on our website, and we've started to add information and frequently asked questions regarding the way that we will assess risk in firms, and more is to follow. It's not our intention, however, to contact every firm and explain what their impact rating is. The sole purpose of that impact rating is to determine how a firm will be supervised, and that approach to supervision will be obvious to your firm. For example, if you have a relationship manager, you will know you're a high impact firm. We have, however, explained today and already through our web content how we will go about assessing impact. Once again, and in conclusion, I'd like to emphasise that one of the key outputs of our risk assessment of firms is that your firm receives an approach to supervision that is proportionate to the risks we believe your firm may present. Good, well-run firms, regardless of which approach to supervision is employed, will not be unduly burdened by our approach to regulating them. So thank you for devoting your time to joining me today. I'd now like the opportunity to ask you a question. Which element of our risk profiling of firms that I've explained to you today would you like more information on? Why we're assessing risk, measures of impact and what they mean, how we risk assess reports of misconduct made to the SRA, and the categories of risk that we are assessing.
I think many people are already voting, Andrew, and it seems quite clear that the majority of the listeners this afternoon would like more information on how we assess reports of misconduct made to the SRA.
Yeah, that's an interesting result. If people want to go to the SRA website, in the risk section, if you look at the menus down the left-hand side, you will find lots of information about our risk assessment processes for firms. The methodology and how we score individual events is explained in some detail.
So I think throughout the webinar, or throughout previous webinars and throughout today, we'll regularly make references to the website, but there is a wealth of information on there, particularly under freedom in practice. So as Andrew's mentioned, if you have a look, you'll be able to gain more information about how we risk assess reports of misconduct. So that's over 70% of you listening.
That's a fairly conclusive result.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much. We welcome and encourage your views and feedback, because these are useful in helping us shape our approach, and also the information we provide to you, both on the website and through webinars such as these. So now I will talk to you about the supervision function within the SRA. Well, Andrew's already covered at some length risk and how we assess risk in firms, and the fact that the risk assessment will be used to guide our supervisory approach to a firm. But if I could just summarise again and say in short, risk is central to our supervisory approach and how we direct and use our resources. So key issues for us will be the consideration of the risk posed, using our resources based on the greatest risks and those which can be mitigated by our supervisory approach. As Andrew mentioned, our resources are limited and we need to use them wisely and for the greatest benefit. You'll have gathered that Supervision have been working closely with the Risk Centre to identify the impact rating of firms, and we will continue to work closely together because, again, it is the impact rating which will drive our supervisory approach to a firm. And the assessment of impact is just about the approach we take to supervision. It is not a measure of the quality of the firm. So for high impact firms, we consider that the approach of relationship management is most suitable here. And we've been piloting this approach over the last 12 months. Again, I'll stress the important point that high impact does not mean that we think a firm is being run in a risky way. Rather, if that firm has problems, it is likely to have a high impact upon our regulatory objectives. So firms assessed as high impact will be relationship managed, and by this we mean they will have a named point of contact at the SRA, a relationship manager. For medium and low impact firms will be a combination of desk-based and oversight, and visits if appropriate. But we will be constructively engaging with firms, and this will be a phased implementation from October, so from next month. So I'll start by talking about relationship management in a little more detail and the pilot that's been running. You might have seen information on our website about the relationship management pilot, heard one of our webinars. There are some webinars specifically in relation to relationship management. Maybe you're even one of the firms that were involved in the pilot. It began last autumn and formally finished at the end of July. Firms were asked to volunteer for the pilot, and we undertook extensive engagement last autumn to raise awareness and to ensure that we had a good cross-section of firms in the scheme. For the pilot, we did not limit ourselves to firms likely to be high impact, and this is because we wanted to have a completely open mind as to how this type of approach could work across all types of firms. We had an extremely positive response, and over 60 firms were happy to volunteer to take part. We were limited as to how many firms we could take, and so we took 19 firms in 3 tranches. And those firms included global, national, and also small niche firms and sole practitioners. We made a series of visits to the firms to test the effectiveness and proportionality of relationship management as a supervisory approach. Again, constructive engagement was key, and our aim was to get a better understanding of the risks firms faced and how the firms were run so that we could put their risks and issues in context. Also, we looked at how firms were identifying and tackling their own risks, and we saw a range of models and methods as to how firms did this. We met with a range of staff from the pilot firms and covered a huge range of issues. We've learned an incredible amount through this process, and we've also had some very positive feedback from the firms involved. So we've been reviewing what we've learned over the past year in the relationship management pilot to help us shape how we think relationship management could be used as a supervisory approach. We will be putting a summary of our findings on the website. However, we thought it would be helpful today to share some of the findings from the pilot in advance. So I'm going to cover a few key points. Firstly, relationship managers have gained and need to have a strong understanding of the sector they regulate and best practice within it. And this can add value to the regulatory process. A detailed understanding of the sector helps us understand and identify risk. Also, relationship management helps build up a two-way relationship, with firms proactively coming to us with issues, and where firms have done this in the pilot, we've worked through those issues with them, and both we and the firm have found this incredibly helpful. We're also working with other units of the SRA to provide what might be called a one SRA approach, which again firms have found constructive. And by a one SRA approach, I mean, for example, if a firm reports to us a serious financial issue, and that would be reported to the relationship manager, if that required a response from a different area of the SRA, the relationship manager would be able to coordinate the approach and work with the firm to address the specific issue, and also any wider issues that might arise within the firm. So relationship management can also help to elevate risk and compliance issues on a firm's agenda. And we've had many instances where our engagement with the firm has enabled the firm themselves to look at risk in a different way. Our view is that large global and city firms would benefit from the relationship management approach, and we intend to roll out relationship management from October this year, so that's from next month, to firms we assess as high impact, and firms within that group will be contacted with the details of their relationship manager as we begin to implement this approach. We do need to build our resources in this area, as with the rest of supervision. So we will be contacting firms on an incremental basis as our ability to resource this approach increases. And now if I move on to talk about medium and low impact firms and supervisory approaches with medium and low impact. Again, in relation to firms assessed as medium or low impact, we've piloted new supervisory approaches. And this pilot started in January this year with the internal recruitment of supervisors. It's due to finish at the end of this month, and we're gathering in our data. There are in excess of 100 firms in the pilot. Again, as I've said, they're medium and low impact firms, roughly a 50-50 split between those two impact bandings. Again, the emphasis is on constructive engagement, and so if risks are identified within a firm that we think should be addressed, our first action has been to phone the firm to talk to them about supervision, the approach, risks and proposed action. We may continue engaging with the firm by telephone or correspondence, or if it is appropriate, we may visit. In this way, we've worked with firms to understand their business, put issues in context and work through any issues. Some matters we've been able to resolve with dialogue between us and the firm, and some matters have proceeded to investigation where we think the issues are such that regulatory action may be necessary. So the pilot has looked at events that occur in firms, and Andrew talked earlier about the risk assessment of events. We've looked at how firms can and should respond to such issues. And if I could give you an example, we received a complaint about a conflict of interest. We engaged with the firm about this, looking at both the substance of the complaint, but also about the firm's systems for spotting conflicts. So we'll look at what checks they're carrying out, how they carry out these checks, and the emphasis is not just on dealing with the current issue, but aims to ensure that systems and processes prevent any such issue occurring again. So in addition to events, the pilot has looked at thematic work. An example of this is first-tier complaints handling. And here we have carried out visits to a random sample of firms and tested matters such as what do firms consider a complaint to be and what does good practice look like. feedback from the firms in the pilot has been extremely positive. In particular, firms have commented upon the fact that initial contact by telephone is appreciated, and again, engagement has been constructive. We are recruiting both internally and externally to fill these key roles in the business. And as we build our resource, we will roll out the supervisory approach of constructive engagement across all medium and low impact firms. And we aim to be in a position in early 2012, so early next year, where every firm will be assigned to a supervisory team at the SRA. And we'll keep you updated of our progress towards that goal via the website and any further webinars. And I think perhaps it's useful to give a further example, a case study, to help explain the risk and supervisory functions and how they'll work in practice. So let's say we receive information about a conflict of interest, and this has occurred at a firm we assess as medium impact. The event itself is assessed as medium risk. The assessment is then considered by the supervisory team responsible for the firm, and a supervisor within the team explores the firm's risk profile. It's noted that 3 out of the 4 categories in the data profile are green, but that the firm's operational risk has been assessed as amber. And just a reminder there, referring back to Andrew's presentation, that those 4 categories are fraud and dishonesty, financial difficulties and instability, operational risk, competency, fitness and propriety. So the supervisor might see that a previous engagement with the firm has noted that there were some weaknesses identified in the implementation of processes within the firm. The supervisor would contact the firm to discuss. As I've said, that would initially be by telephone contact, if that was practical. The firm agreed to review the conflict procedures and provide information to the supervisor when they've done so. Engagement continues until the supervisor is satisfied that the issues have been addressed. If appropriate, the supervisor may visit the firm to discuss systems generally and also review what the firm have done specifically with the conflict process. So this is just one example of how supervision may work in practice. And again, I'll refer to our website where there's information about both of the pilots, that's the relationship management pilot and the supervision pilot. Also, lots of information about risk. I think Andrew and I thought it would be particularly useful to signpost to OFR at a glance, which is on the website, because it's a useful and practical summary of outcomes-focused regulation and gives lots of good examples. We are going to take questions, but before we do that, we have another polling question for you. So, could we ask you, which areas would you like more information on? Authorisation, risk, supervision and enforcement. There have been webinars on each of those areas, but we're again welcoming and encouraging feedback as to where we might want to focus any further webinars going forward. And it seems that supervision, about 50% of the listeners today would like more information on supervision.
It seems that risk is coming in second place, 32%.
And not many of you want to know much about authorisation or enforcement. We did do a webinar on Friday that covered supervision and enforcement, so perhaps that might be a good starting point, but we will take that feedback away with us because we do have more webinars scheduled and we can therefore decide where the focus needs to be, and as we've said, that seems to be supervision and risk. Thank you very much. And now you can ask us questions. You'll see that to text a question you need to use the on-screen Q&A box. If you would like to ask a question by telephone, the telephone number and the PIN code are displayed there. You need to type your name and "I want to ask a telephone question" in the on-screen Q&A box. So the instructions are there. Questions are actually already coming in. Before we answer any of those, I did want to bring forward a question from Friday. So as I say, on Friday there was a webinar on supervision and enforcement. and somebody asked a question in relation to self-assessment. So they asked, is there a self-assessment risk questionnaire? And I know Andrew is very interested in this area, so I did say on Friday that I'd bring that question to the webinar today and ask Andrew to answer that. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Helen. Yeah, self-assessment is an area that the SRA is really interested in as a way of gathering regulatory data, but also improving standards across firms. There is no self-assessment questionnaire at present that the SRA is implementing, but it is an area that we're exploring. And we know, for example, that other regulators use self-assessment as a tool to understand what's happening in firms. I've got a personal perspective on self-assessment, and I'm really keen to see it in action in the SRA. I've actually used it as a tool myself in another organisation that I work for, and the insights that it can provide are extremely powerful. A really critical self-evaluation of the way that you implement your processes, the way that your business operates, really will open your eyes as to areas that you can improve, and improvements can have a real impact on the bottom line, how much money you make and other areas. There's a second perspective that I have personally, is that I've actually seen it in action in legal regulators in New South Wales in Australia. Self-assessment is a tool that's used over there for firms that can incorporate, and research has shown that firms that go through the self-assessment process have at least a 33% drop in the number of complaints that they receive. And I think the way that the research pans out is that it directly ties back to that individual assessment of the way your firm operates, the processes and procedures, and by tightening up the areas where the information is highlighted, it gives the firm the opportunity to put in place improvements, and the consequence is a drop in complaints. I'm sure you all know that dealing with complaints, isn't it a hot topic at the moment in respect of first-tier complaints handling within firms, but also is extremely impactful on your businesses in terms of the time it takes to deal with complaints. So self-assessment could have real benefits, and it's certainly an area that we're exploring quite closely at the moment in respect of implementing in the SRA.
Thank you, Andrew. You just touched there upon first-tier complaints, and we've had a question in asking about the information that's being requested on first-tier complaints, and somebody wants to know why we're asking for that information.
Yeah, I'm sure anybody who follows the legal media will know that there's a lot of negative publicity about how firms handle complaints at the moment. Reports by the Legal Services Board, for example, has highlighted some pretty poor practice in complaints handling. And our activity in supervision and previously prior to OFR in the past has shown that complaints handling is an area where we think improvements can be made. And it was actually one of the key drivers for the Legal Services Act. And Section 112 of the Act puts a direct responsibility on the SRA as an approved regulator to make sure that firms have appropriate provisions for answering complaints. So at the moment that is one of the key areas that we're looking at in terms of our first forays into thematic risk. So there is a new question on renewals this year. That question is on the SRA website along with some guidance, and we have a second set of guidance and frequently asked questions ready to go on the website shortly, which will give you more information about the information that we are aiming to collect. So it is a hot topic, as we've said, and it is our first attempt at thematic risk that we'll be going into.
Thank you, Andrew. I've got some questions that have come in on supervision. We've just had incidentally a question saying they missed the information about seeing the webinar slides, so never want to miss the opportunity to plug our website. Again, they're on the website. There's a Freedom in Practice banner, and it's underneath that, behind that, there's lots of information about OFR, supervision risk, etc., and all the webinars are listed there. And there's been webinars going on for several months now covering all sorts of topics that definitely worth looking back and listening to some of those webinars. In relation to some supervision questions, Mohammed has asked how we can link supervision to relationship management, and someone's asked, is a supervision manager the same as a relationship manager? So I think perhaps if I just outline the structure of the function, there is a supervision director, and then there are two supervision managers, of which I am one. There are then the thematic risk, firm-based risk, and the relationship managers. So a supervision manager is not the same as a relationship manager. Somebody has also asked, can you request a relationship manager? Relationship managers will be assigned to those firms assessed as high impact. So that's a decision that will be made by the SRA. And as I said, you'll be notified of your relationship manager on an incremental basis from October this year as we build our resource in the supervision function. I think we've also had a question asking, will firms be told which supervisory team they've been allocated to? Yes, as I've said, starting from next month, so from October, we will start incrementally allocating, and we're hoping to be in a position by early 2012 to have allocated to a supervisory team. And I did again mention that we'll keep updated information on the website, so it's a good way of keeping in touch with where we're at with that particular aspect of supervision.
Okay, we've had a question from Louisa about what do we mean by a low-impact firm. As we've explained, whenever we talk about impacts, we're talking about the impacts a firm may have on our regulatory objectives. As we explained earlier on in the webinar, we apply a series of measures, and so what we've decided are the firms that would impact on our objectives are the very large firms, the firms that have a very vulnerable client base, and the firms where there are complex branch structures and where there are large numbers of fee earners, which again is another measure of size. And we're also looking at firms that hold client money. We've tried to be a bit more sophisticated about the levels of client money that have been held in respect of how we go about measuring that. So it's a combination of those factors will determine whether you're a high, medium or low impact firm. Most small firms will be low impact, and that's the way that the current split of firms is panning out. There'll be maybe at a maximum 200 high impact firms, maybe 2,000 medium impact firms, and the bulk of firms within the legal services market, almost 9,000 firms, will be low impact. So that's how our assessments are stacking up at the moment.
We've had a question in, or perhaps a query in relation to OFR and outcomes-focused regulation. Should this be a concern? And we'd really like to reiterate that OFR should not cause any concern for well-run firms. We have conducted a survey recently, and 2/3 of the respondents who are familiar with the principles of OFR did not think that it would mean a radical change in the way they conduct their business. So again, no concern for well-run firms. We've had a question in from Sarah asking for some practical tips. I referred to OFR at a glance. That's a very good starting point, which gives a summary of OFR and lots of examples. It's also got all the detail in it about appointments and timelines for your corp and coffers. I think really you need to think about how your business is structured. Are you delivering your services in the best way for your particular clients? Clients are at the heart of OFR. But OFR is also about firms having the flexibility to deliver in the best way for their clients. You know your client base and how they best wish to receive the service. So perhaps OFR at a glance is a good starting point. Reviewing your management structure. Practical point, you need to change your note paper, because any website emails and note paper should say regulated and authorised by the SRA and include the firm's name and registered or SRA number.
Okay, we've also had a question about small firms and whether they will be supervised even if they're considered low risk. Well, the answer is yes, all firms will be owned by supervision and all firms will be supervised. The approach to supervision is what the risk assessment will determine. So if a firm is a low impact firm and our risk profiles are telling us that there's no inherent risks that are currently flagging up against that firm, the intensity of supervision will be very limited. If there are no events being reported to us, effectively that firm won't hear from us. It's when events start to come in and when other risk triggers might occur that we would start to think about supervising that firm. The profile itself will just help the supervisor to gather that information, put it in context with what they know about the firm and make some decisions about whether to engage with them or not. So that's how we envisage it working with the small firms that are deemed to be low risk.
And just following on from that, Andrew, there's perhaps a question come in from another Andrew, asking how frequently might an average high-impact firm expect formal meetings. Again, it will be a flexible approach and it will relate to that particular high-impact firm. So there's no formulaic, there will be a meeting every month for every high-impact firm. The strategy of engagement will be decided upon in relation to that firm and any particular risks posed. So there's not a definite approach for all high-impact firms. It will be on a firm-by-firm basis for the high-impact firms, and that will be discussion possibly at first series of meetings between the firm and the relationship manager. I've had a question in, Andrew, from Adele, asking will random visits still occur? There might be some random visits, baselining purposes, looking at compliance going forward, and that would probably be undertaken by the thematic team.
I've had a question from Graham about will we be giving additional focus to new ABSs in terms of risk? Obviously ABSs are a complete unknown in the legal services market at the moment, and we've been putting a lot of effort into our application to become a licensing body, into understanding the risks that are there. We're engaging with prospective ABSs and have been for some time, and we've done lots of analysis and research around the potential impacts that ABSs might have. So yes, there will be focus on ABSs in respect of risk when they're licensed. And on that note, our current anticipation of the decision to designate us as a licensing body is that might happen in December or January, and that's when we will start to license our first ABSs. Many of you will have seen in the press criticism around the SRA in respect of delays in licensing ABSs, which were due to start on the 6th of October. And hopefully you've also seen the fairly robust response that our chairman, Charles Plant, gave. We've had our processes and procedures for our ABS licensing application ongoing for a long time now, and we've met all our deadlines in doing so. It is just now down to the parliamentary timetable and the fact that they just could not fit it in readiness for the 6th of October.
Andrew, I'm just looking at some of the questions coming in. There seem to be a few questions phrased in slightly different ways, asking about will firms know what their risk score is or their impact banding?
Yeah, as we said, the risk assessments are confidential to us. They're here to help us make decisions about regulating you as firms. We've got no intention at the moment of writing out to everybody, all 11,000 firms, explaining what their impact band is and therefore the approach to supervision. If you're high impact, you will know that you're high impact because you'll have a relationship manager. In actual fact, when you look at the measures that we use, there's very little that you can actually do to change that impact measure. I don't think any firm would want to turn over less money in order to reduce their impact band. So at the moment, it will be extremely disproportionate for us to write to every single firm to outline what their impact measure is. The introduction of MySRA will allow us to make sure that the data we're using to come up with those impact measures is the right data. That's one of the concerns we've always had, is that the data that we use as provided by firms can contain errors, and particularly around things like turnover. There is some missing data, and we've done lots of work to try and overcome that. But the opportunity presented by MySRA will mean that the data that we have coming in will be the most up-to-date data that we've got, and directly provided online. So we will re-evaluate the impact ratings that we've got now once we've got the latest round of information through on MySRA.
And I think really just to repeat that the impact band that a firm is in is just to direct the supervisory approach. So again, if you're high impact, that's a relationship manager, but that will be a very small percentage of the regulated community. I think Andrew mentioned maybe 100 to 200 firms. The vast majority of firms will be assessed as low impact, and again that's just to direct the supervisory approach. I think I referred earlier to medium and low impact firms. They will have constructive engagement, perhaps some regulatory oversight, and perhaps visits if it's deemed appropriate in the circumstances. There's quite a few questions about knowing impact banding. Again, I'll direct to the website because there's some frequently answered questions, and those include will firms be told what their risk score is and why you're collecting information on complaints. There's a lot of useful information on the website that might in fact answer some of the queries that are coming in today.
On the point about first-tier complaints handling, there's been a question submitted by Sarah, I think it was, asking when the new and the second set of guidance will go online. I actually signed it off yesterday, and it will be sent through to our web team shortly. So any day now, that new guidance will go on there, and that sort of is in addition to the guidance that's already on there. We've also had a question around what constitutes a formal complaint. The definition that we've used is in the frequently asked questions on the website now. The question that we've had specifically says, does it mean that a complaint has gone through the formal complaints process? And I think the answer is yes. If somebody just expresses mild dissatisfaction, but is fundamentally satisfied with the service that they've received, we wouldn't expect that to constitute a formal complaint. These are complaints that you've had to deal with as a firm through your complaints process.
I think we're also gathering some more information, Andrew, on what is a complaint, what does it look like, and how do different firms categorise complaints. Through the thematic piece of work we're doing on first-tier complaints handling, that hasn't concluded yet, but when it does, again, we'll be publishing those results on the website.
I think it's an important point to note, Helen, that the supervision work that's being done on first-tier complaints handling as a theme will be married up with the results that we get through from the question that we ask on renewal. And the benefit of asking it on renewal is that we can directly allocate the information that's provided to us actually to a firm, so we can put some context on the firm and what the data is telling us about their first-tier complaints handling. So, for example, we did have questions about large corporate firms whose clients can't actually complain to legal services, to the legal ombudsman. And therefore, the fact that we know that it's a large corporate firm that's reporting this information to us, we can draw some context around their clients into the data that's provided. So the fact that none of their complaints were referred to Leo is understood in the context of their client base. So there's a lot of benefit in asking for the information at renewals so that we can contextualise the information and then marry it to the more qualitative data that's coming out of the supervision work that's ongoing at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew, we've had a question from Julian asking if there's any intention to publish perhaps lists of common risk areas, and again perhaps directing risk areas for small firms, medium firms and so on.
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that we're exploring in the Risk Centre is the publication of a risk outlook, the SRA's view of risk, and maybe one of the options that we have is segmenting that by different sectors of the market. We're doing quite a lot of work at the moment on segmentation of the market, along with the Legal Services Board. What we want to do is to provide risk information that's relevant to your firms. There's no point just putting out a risk outlook that covers every risk known to man. We want to make it directly relevant to the audience that we want to pick up. So yes, we are looking at risk outlooks. We're also looking at risk bulletins. Some feedback we had from a reference group was that risk bulletins around very specific things that are emerging at the moment will be very helpful to firms. So for example, around issues where identity theft has been a problem for firms and caused problems, that we can put out some guidance that allows firms to recognise the warning signs. In a similar way to the warning cards point out issues around other kinds of fraud, in a way that's quite helpful to firms to pick up what they need to do to monitor those risks.
On a different topic from risk and supervision, we've had a few questions or a few comments about problems that listeners have been experiencing with MySRA, particularly when those issues might be resolved. I know there's significant work ongoing to resolve any issues. I'm not aware of the updated project plan, but certainly again there'll be information on the website, and we'll take back the number of people who have raised issues and the types of issues that you're raising in your questions with MySRA.
We've had a question from Sarah saying that providers are still advertising get ready for PSU training. PSU actually is no more, and there won't be any further PSU visits. The role of visiting and engaging with firms is being taken over by supervision, so there will actually be no more PSU visits from now on. And we've had a question about the issue of altering the stationery to say that they're authorised and regulated by the SRA, whether we can do it from now or whether you need to wait until the 6th of October. Certainly by the 6th of October you need to have measures in place to alter your note paper. In respect of OFR, if you're not ready quite by the 6th of October, we're not going to come down heavy with the big stick on all those firms that can't demonstrate that they've met those requirements. However, it is a requirement, and there's a reason behind why we're changing it to authorised and regulated. We have a new authorisation function, and the statement is a direct reference to the fact that entry to the profession is through a rigorous authorisation process, and that gives consumer confidence in the fact that firms have to be authorised in the first place and then regulated by the SRA, and that new approach to authorisation is much more rigorous than it's been in the past. And I think that's the real reason behind the statement going on the note paper.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that topic, Angela has asked what is the penalty for late implementation of the additional wording. Again, Angela and others, we would ask that from the 6th of October, if we came across incorrect note paper, as I've discussed, there would be constructive engagement, and that would start with a telephone call. So we'd phone you up and ask you to change it, and then we'd ask you to advise us when that had been done. So no penalty as such in that sense, if as a result of the telephone call you change your note paper. We're just looking at further questions that have come in. There are groups of questions, some of which we have answered. Andrew, have you got a question there?
Yeah, okay.
About risk, is a risk register a requirement?
How firms go about monitoring and mitigating their own risk is entirely down to the firm. It's what's appropriate for your business. And this is very much the focus of outcomes-focused regulation. It's putting the onus on you to manage your risks in the appropriate way. Provided you can demonstrate that the measures you have in place are appropriate, a risk register might not be necessary. It's entirely down to the context of your individual firm.
So Fiona asks, surely big firms with appropriate governance structures and advanced approaches to risk will be assessed as low risk. That's not necessarily the case, because size is a determinative factor in relation to impact banding. It might be that a firm is assessed as high risk, but if they do have appropriate governance structures and advanced risk assessment in place, then the level of the engagement, so perhaps they might have a relationship manager, but perhaps the level of contact between the firm and the manager will be reduced.
Okay. Returning back to first-tier complaints handling, which seems to be a bit of a theme through the questions, we had a really good question from Nicola asking, does a complaint from a non-client, for example a third party, or a solicitor representing another party, constitute a complaint? No, it doesn't. The SRA gets lots of complaints, obviously reported from third parties, but in respect of the firm's first-tier complaint handling, this is about complaints made by your clients. So no, a complaint from a third party doesn't count in terms of answering the question that will be asked at renewals.
I had a question in from Janine Andrew asking what kind of information will a relationship manager want to know about a high impact firm when they first make contact? Well, again, that will be different in every case, but generally relationship manager will want to know about business, governance, processes, etc., perhaps risk identification, maybe there's a risk register, but there'll be initial contacts, and exactly what the relationship manager would like to see will be discussed then, and it will be a series of constructive engagement meetings, so it's not that they will be asked from the outset to provide reams of information. It's a two-way relationship, as I referred to earlier.
Yep. Just had a question from Julian related to the earlier question about authorised and regulated by, very correctly highlighting that I missed the point. It's whether or not you can use it now, whether you have to wait till the 6th of October. I think it's directly linked to the incoming of the handbook in 6th of October, the new authorisation rules and processes. So I would say use it from the 6th of October. Obviously you may want to prepare before the 6th of October by having your note paper printed up and ready, but I will confirm that point, and we'll get some information back onto the SRA website about precisely what the requirements are related to the new headed paper.
Another question on risk, Andrew. Someone's just asked for a confirmation of the risk categories. I think I referred to them in the case study. There are 4 categories. The first is fraud and dishonesty. The second is financial difficulties and instability. The third is operational risks. And the fourth is competency, fitness and propriety. So those are the 4 risk categories. I think Andrew referred to them, and I also talked about them in the case study at the end of the supervision presentation.
Okay, we've got a question about risk assessing events, again from another Andrew. So when we're assessing risks in an event reported to us about a firm as opposed to the firm's risk assessment, would we disclose to the firm what that assessment actually is? We don't disclose the risk assessment itself, what the risk assessment does, it allows us to make the decision as to what kind of contact we're going to have with the firm. Previously that would have been about whether or not we sent it to our conduct investigation unit, who would have launched an investigation through correspondence. Now, because of the changes to our investigative protocols that I outlined during the webinar, it's a very different approach. The fact that we've had this event reported to us would just be a trigger for supervision to look at the firm and decide whether or not there's any engagement that's required. Previously we have actually notified firms that we've had this, a report sent in, but now it's going to be a little bit different in respect of what the supervisor thinks is necessary in the context of what they understand about the firm.
Andrew, I think we've got time for one more question. I'm mindful of the fact I also need to give the code for the CPD code for today's webinar. There seems to be quite a lot of questions about the fact we've mentioned changing your note paper. So authorised and regulated from the 6th of October. Someone's commented that they've already done it. And again, given our new approach, constructive relationship, if you're a little bit ahead of time, someone asked if there was a penalty. Can't imagine that that's going to be assessed as a high-risk matter.
No, very much agree that it is a low-risk matter. We're certainly not going to go down the road of disciplinary proceedings in respect of people being ahead of requirements in respect of authorised and regulated.
So thank you again for your questions. Final plug for our website, because there is an email address you can contact us through if you have any queries or any comments or feedback you'd like to make. And I think finally now we'll turn to, well, there's a reminder that we've got 22 days to go to the 6th of October, the introduction of the new handbook, Outcomes Focused Regulation. And finally, so thank you very much for joining us and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.